Welcome everyone to another one of our PRD webinars. This has been quite a series. If this is your first webinar with us, I want to just let you know that we have quite a few webinars that we've done since the PRD has started rolling out, and they are available at prd.fa.gov. There's some links there where you can view all those. But anyway, so thank you for joining us today. So we're going to talk about a very specific set of reporting records today. We've already talked about some other types. We talked about reporting drug and alcohol records previously. We talked about reporting training records. And so we're sort of wrapping up this group of webinars that's talking about, how to report these records. So this one is going to talk about reporting disciplinary actions, also separation of employment records, and finally, records related to checking the NDR or the National Driver Register. So we'll talk about those, and then we'll see a little bit of a demo. The demo is pretty short and sweet because it's pretty straightforward on how to enter them. So just a little reminder of who's on the call today and who's involved in the PRD program. Of course, the PRD is based at the Aviation Data Systems branch in Oklahoma City, and I am Chris Morris. I am the PRD program manager. We have Stacy Smith on the call today. She's the assistant PRD program manager. And then we also have Scott and Pam with us as well. And they're the folks that respond to your questions that you might email in to prd.support@fa.gov. So they're the folks that generally help you with questions and stuff that come in there. Speaking of questions, Cindy already mentioned this. So the way that we're going to handle questions for the webinar is there is a question and answer box provided as part of Zoom. So you can just type your question in there. And during the webinar, your question may get answered by Scott or Pam or Stacy because they're kind of monitoring those questions and they may try and give you a response. Some questions we may save until the very end if we have time, and I just answer them verbally. And some questions may require more research on our part. It just takes more time to answer them, or we may just, run out of time. And in those cases, we will respond to you by email. But we try really hard to always get back to you. So if you don't hear your question answered today during the webinar, then you know that we'll respond in a few days, typically by email. So that's how we're going to answer your questions. And of course, this presentation is going to be recorded, and we will post it at prd.fa.gov in a few days. And we also have there, in a few days, we'll have the PowerPoint slides. So if you just want the slides, you can get those there as well. So as I kind of already mentioned, we're going to talk about final disciplinary action records. That's kind of a mouthful, but there's a reason that it's named that, and we'll talk about those when we get there. I'm just going to call them disciplinary records during the presentation just to keep it easier. It's not such a mouthful. We're also going to talk about records concerning separation of employment. Another kind of a long way to phrase that. We'll just call them separation records during the presentation. And then finally, we'll talk about the National Driver Register records. And that one's a little bit different. We'll discuss it as well when we get to that place in the webinar. And then finally, we'll do some walkthroughs on how you actually report, each of these three types of records into PRD. So we have screenshots, so we'll kind of walk you through it. But again, it's pretty straightforward. So I don't think that'll give you much trouble. So just kind of as a reminder as to, who can actually report these records into the PRD system, you have to have one of these user roles to be able to report records into the system. So if you're an authorized responsible person, you can report pilot records into the PRD, or if you have an authorized user contributor account, or we just call it a contributor account. It's just easier. If you have a contributor account in PRD, you can also report pilot records. So, and this is the same also if you're, working in that proxy space or a trustee. If you don't know what proxy or trustee means, then it just doesn't apply to you. You don't have to worry about it. Okay, but those of you that are in that group, you'll say, "Oh yeah, I'm a proxy contributor." So, but it behaves the same, really. So let's go ahead and talk about the disciplinary action records. So I want to kind of spend a little bit of time on what qualifies as a disciplinary record, because we have received a lot of questions in this space. So I think this will be helpful to you. So this information I took straight from Part 111. You can also get this from the advisory circular as well. But let's just kind of parse this down so that it'll kind of make sense. So a disciplinary record that's reported to PRD is a record of a corrective or punitive action taken by an operator who's subject to Part 111. And this next part's important, in response to an event pertaining to pilot performance. That part's really key. So this is, events that relate to that employee's behavior as a pilot. So if there were other types of disciplinary behavior that resulted in, a suspension or a warning letter or whatever for that individual, if it didn't have anything to do with them as a pilot, then it wouldn't be reported to PRD. Okay, so for example, if let's say the employee was involved in credit card misuse, for example, that's not really directly related to pilot performance, so that would not need to be reported to PRD. Now, the other thing that's really important about when you report disciplinary records is you're not allowed to report the disciplinary record to PRD until it's considered final. And final is determined by the operator, by you, essentially, by your company. So that may sound kind of funny, but the point of it is, if your company has a process of appeals or, board review or whatever process that you might have for disciplinary records, you're not to report those records into PRD until you have completed that process, whatever that might be for your company. Okay, so it's really going to be an individual activity here. But whatever that process is, when it's complete and there's no more appeal, etc., within your company process, then that's when PRD considers that action final. And at that point, that starts the reporting requirement. Okay, so if you have a 90-day appeal window, for example, then you don't report that for that 90 days. The record's not final, so you wouldn't report it. So I hope that makes sense, but it's a pretty important distinction. So the next question is, how soon must a disciplinary record be reported? Well, once it becomes final, and your company is the one that decides that, legitimately. So once your company decides it is final, it's a final record, then it becomes reportable within 30 days, which is kind of the same as most of the other records in PRD. They're generally reportable within 30 days. So anyway, so I hope that makes sense. So the next popular question we get around disciplinary actions is, does the PAC exception apply? And the answer is yes. If you're wondering what is the PAC exception, I'll go over it briefly here. It's not in the slide, but we'll just talk about it. But yes, the PAC exception does apply. However, you cannot take the PAC exception. And again, the PAC exception is basically delayed reporting. It's not reporting in 30 days. We'll talk about it in a second. But you cannot delay reporting if the disciplinary action involves removal from aircraft operations. So if part of the disciplinary action, for example, was, a 30-day suspension from flying duties, If you're a pack operator, you can't exercise the pack exception and not report that to PRD. You have to report it just like everybody else. So as a reminder about the pack exception, so what the pack exception is about is if you are a public aircraft operator or a air tour operator or a corporate operator. So if you fall in that very small group, very special group, then you do not, as a rule of thumb, have to report pilot records within 30 days. You can instead hold on to the records for up to 5 years and report those records on request. So the pack exception does not apply to 121 operators or 135 operators or 125 operators. So those folks, you don't have a pack exception. You have to report within 30 days. But anyway, we have discussed the pack exception in other webinars, so I don't want to keep harping on it, but I just wanted to remind you in case you were like, what is he talking about? Okay. So if you are exercising the pack exception and not reporting these disciplinary records, then if you get a request for that pilot record from a potential employer, then you have 14 days to then report the record to PRD. Okay, so I know that was kind of a lot about pack exceptions. So there is another item related to disciplinary records, and that is supporting documents, or sometimes we call them relevant documents. So you might see that term used, both ways. When we're discussing this in PRD, we'll talk about it as supporting documents and we'll talk about it as relevant documents, but it really means the same thing. So the idea is if you have other documents that are related to the disciplinary action, you don't report those into PRD, but you do report the existence of those records. And the point of that is because you're required to share those supporting documents if another employer asks for them. Okay, so I'll show you an example. There's a little yes/no box that you say yes, there are supporting documents, or you say no, there are not supporting documents, and that allows a potential employer to later ask you for those supporting documents. Okay, so that's what that's about. So yeah, you have to indicate if there are, and then you have to keep those supporting documents for 5 years. After 5 years, you're no longer required to keep those documents. And if you get a request for supporting documents, then you will provide them within 14 days. And again, supporting documents are not reported via the PRD system. There's no way to put them in the system. You don't scan them or any of that stuff. So if you get a request for supporting documents, you have to share them by, fax or mail, and the way that works is the requester who asks you for these records, they can actually indicate, a method that they prefer. Like they can give you a email address or a mailing address, whatever. So that's about the supporting or relevant documents. So another kind of interesting point, and this is again outlined in part 111, is if you've already reported a disciplinary record, but then for some, because you thought it was final, but then for some reason, the record gets overturned, then you have to either correct the record or suppress it in PRD within 10 days. So really what it means is that if for some reason the disciplinary record is no longer applicable, you can't just leave it in PRD. You have to pull it out. Of course, there's no deleting records, right? In PRD, there's no delete function. So that's why we have suppress. So, but you can suppress a record and it's no longer visible to the pilot or to potential employers. Okay, so you have 10 days to do that. So just kind of a reminder that you should only report disciplinary records if it's an action taken by an employer that imposes an adverse action on that pilot, like a suspension or a warning letter, of course, if they get fired. And really importantly, it's directly involved to their performance as a pilot. Okay. And of course, that hasn't been overturned. I also wanted to mention one other question that we get a fair amount, and that has to do when some people have asked, well, if a pilot gets suspended, let's say they get a 90-day suspension, and so that gets reported to PRD. The question is, when the suspension is over, can you then pull that out of PRD? And the answer is no. The only case that the regulation allows you to suppress a record after their time is served, so to say, is if the record was actually overturned. And really what they mean by that is if it was decided later that it didn't really happen, the pilot didn't do this thing that they were accused of. So, so I hope that makes sense. So just because they served their time, that doesn't mean the record goes away. The record stays there. But if later on it was decided that no, the pilot didn't do this action we accused them of, then yes, it would be appropriate to suppress the record in PRD. Okay. And then I gave you some references there. There's the paragraph number in AC 12068 Juliet. And then also I gave you the regulatory reference if you wanted to go look at that. So that's kind of everything about the disciplinary records that's, most important to let you know about. Let's move on to the next one, which is the separation of employment records. So first question, well, of course, what qualifies as a separation record? Well, this is probably pretty obvious. It's when the person no longer works for your company because they resigned or they got fired, or maybe they lost their medical. There could be all sorts of reasons why people, leave your employment. But whenever that event occurs, it is reportable to PRD. So how fast do you have to report this? Well, you probably know the answer. It's 30 days. Okay. So oops, I went pretty fast on that slide, but it's 30 days, just like most of the other ones. I did want to briefly show you the different separation types that you can pick from. And we know that these may not always match the separation types that operators have established. But when working in PRD, you should try and pick the most applicable one, the best one. And there is an other option, but so you have termination, and that would be for pilot performance. You also have termination under professional disqualification. And those two are kind of special because they're termination records, and they have to do with the PAC exception. We'll talk about that in just a second. You also have employer initiated separation, but for something unrelated to pilot performance, so that might be the employee, was misusing the credit card, and so you guys let the employee go. Well, that might be a good example for this one, because it really didn't have anything to do with them as a pilot, but the company initiated the separation. There could be a physical or medical disqualification. They could just resign. That happens. They could retire. And then there is the other box. So if you just don't see what fits best, you can put other, and then you'll get a way to, free form kind of describe, what the other means. So does the PAC exception apply? And again, PAC exception is basically delayed reporting, or I guess not reporting unless a future employer comes asking for it, and then you have to report it. So does the PAC exception apply to these separation records? Well, yes, it does, meaning that if you're a PAC operator, you can not report these things. You just have to retain any record for 5 years and then report it within 14 days if someone comes asking. But there is an exception, and that is for terminations. Okay, so those first two there, termination for pilot performance or termination for professional disqualification. If it's a termination, then related to pilot duties, then that's always reportable within 30 days. You don't have a choice to not report that. And I just want to touch on, why does the PAC exception work that way? Because it did something similar over in the disciplinary records. Remember, if the disciplinary action involved removal from flight status, then we said, okay, no, you can't exercise the PAC exception. You have to always report that record. And I think it'll make sense when I remind you why it's arranged that way. Because if the pilot used to work for your company, and let's say that you guys fired the pilot for, pilot performance or, whatever you picked here, but you did not report it to PRD. Well, it's possible that the pilot might also not mention that they worked for your company. The pilots are required to provide a 5-year history of their employment in PRD, but if they just leave someone off, PRD can't catch that, right? PRD doesn't really know. So if the pilot doesn't say they worked for you, and you guys as an operator don't report these airmen, then really the airmen could just kind of slide through, right? That whatever happened wouldn't be known to the new employer. Whereas, if the airman had a disciplinary action that removed them from flying status, and because you're going to report that, even if the pilot doesn't mention that they used to fly for you, your record is still going to be present. And so the new employer is going to say, hey, I see you have a record from this company, but you didn't tell us that you worked there. What's the deal, right? So that's why there's some things that you can't delay reporting on. I hope that makes sense. Same thing applies for supporting and relevant documents related to separation of employment. If you have relevant supporting documents, then you're to indicate that in the PRD when you make the record. And you then hold those records for 5 years. And if someone asks you for the record via the PRD system, you have 14 days to provide that record. Okay. And just like before, you provide those records outside of PRD. So you would mail it or you would fax it or, whatever is agreeable to both parties. So we're almost done with separation of employment, but I wanted to make this point, and I'll reiterate this again when we look at the walkthrough. So the employment, the separation of employment record is part of the employment record in PRD. And what I mean by that is when you hire the pilot, you would report within 30 days that you hired the pilot, and there's an employment record for that. Well, a single employment record includes both the starting of employment and the ending of employment. So if you hire the pilot in 2023 and you report that to PRD, then in 2026, the pilot leaves, the pilot resigns, then you could come back to PRD and you would find that same employment record and you would just add the new separation date. I'll show you that. It'll make a little more sense. But really the point of it is you want to avoid, generating an employment record in 2023 and then adding a new record in 2026 that just has separation of employment. The system would probably actually give you trouble with that. It would make you, so you probably would figure out, oh, I'm not supposed to do that. But anyway, it'll make more sense when I show you the demo. Okay. And if by chance you haven't entered any employment records for that pilot, let's say you're a PAC operator, and so you never reported the hire date because no one ever asked you for it, which is fine. But then you have this termination record. It's perfectly okay just to create a new employment record, and you would just do both at the same time. You would type in when you hired them, and you would type in when they left. So you'll see that in an example, and it'll make a lot more sense. Again, here's the reference where you can go look that up for later. There's the AC paragraph that kind of talks about this, and then the regulatory references there as well. So the last one, which is pretty short and sweet, but often misunderstood, is the National Driver Register, the NDR check. You know, the NDR check has been complicated for industry to perform for many, many years. And a really important thing to understand is that PRD does not change the NDR process at all. The way that your company has been performing NDR checks for new pilots has not changed. It's the same. The only thing that you have to do now that's sort of different is you have to report to PRD once you've completed that NDR check during the onboarding process. And so as part of this discussion, we'll kind of touch base on, what is the process? What is it you're supposed to do to complete this NDR check? So as you probably remember or are aware, the National Driver Register is a national database where states will submit information from their local DMVs up to this NDR database, like, for example, DUIs. Okay, so like I'm in Oklahoma, so the state of Oklahoma may send information to the NDR that says, this person had a DUI on this date, for example. And other states can do the same thing, right? Other states, so all the states, there's if they participate, because I think not all states do, but if they participate, they send this, for example, DUI information up to the NDR. And this gives you, as an operator, a good place to get an overall picture of these sorts of activities without having to send a request to every state, right? Because the idea is that you can check the NDR, and the NDR will tell you state of Oklahoma has a hit or the state of Illinois has a hit. Okay, so that's the general idea of the NDR database. Now, the NDR query, of course, this occurs when you're hiring a new pilot. So, but it only applies to air carriers. Okay, so 121, actually, it's also 125, and those weren't air carriers, but so 121, 125, and Part 135 operators. So if you're in the PAT group or 91K, you're not required to do the NDR background check. So here's the basic idea of how the NDR works. So the hiring operator, they call them here the reviewing entity, you have to get the written consent from the pilot to to initiate an NDR search. And after you get the written consent, then you submit the request to the NDR, and the NDR will reply to you and say, no matches, or they'll say, we found one state with a match or two states, but they may not really tell you what the match is. They'll just say, you need to go check Oklahoma. Okay, so when you send off the NDR request and you get the response back, then if there is a pointer, then you will have to continue your research and go check with those individual states. Okay, so it goes on to say, if the search indicates that there's a record of concern, then you have to then contact that DMV to figure out what exactly is in the record. Okay, so it can be a bit of a chase, So, and the FAA gives you FAA Form 8060-13, which is the NDR request form. But if you're not familiar with this process, that the -13 is provided to you as kind of like a courtesy. But many states will not accept that form. Many states want you to use their own form to make these requests. And you will typically have to make an NDR search through a state. Like you'll have to, let's say you go to Texas, for example, you can contact Texas and Texas will do an NDR search for you. But they have their own form. You know, they're like -13, what's that? So don't be surprised if people don't accept that 13 form. So you know, you're going through this process, you sent your request to the NDR came back, and let's say it said you have a pointer hit in Oklahoma. So then you contact the Oklahoma DMV. They probably have their own form, and you ask them for the record. And then when you get the response back from the state of Oklahoma in this example, once you as a company have received those responses and evaluated it, then that date, that's the date that you record in the PRD system. So we can sum all it up and just say, the only thing that you put in PRD about NDR is the date that you completed the review. So PRD does not take any driving records. It does not take any events that you find. So if you find a DUI or something, you don't report that to PRD. You only report that you completed the review and the date, essentially. Okay. You do have to retain the evidence of this search for 5 years. So whatever records that you receive in response to the NDR search, you retain those for 5 years. And that's to show compliance with the statute, with the, you know, MPart 111. So you'll want to keep that tucked away somewhere so that if the FAA comes asking, you can say, yep, we hired this pilot and we did the NDR check. Here's all the evidence that we did it. And then here's the date that we added to PRD. So, and again, there's the reference for you. So you can look that up when you have a chance. So now we're going to go through the walkthrough. This part's going to be a lot quicker because there's just not a whole lot to it, but we'll walk through adding each of these 3 record types and kind of what it looks like. So this is the page that you'll see after you have searched for and selected the pilot. I'm not showing that part of the process here because we've been over it several times. So if you want to see how that works, go back and look at our previous webinar, particularly the one that talks about just reporting pilot records in general. Okay, it shows you, you know, how do you search for a pilot and that sort of thing. So, but once you have searched for a pilot and you've selected them, then you'll land on a page kind of like this. And you'll also notice that I have redacted the certificate number and the names. Those will obviously be displayed for you when you log in. So you'll know what pilot you're reporting for. So they're just grayed out here just because we don't want to accidentally share something that might be a real name or certificate number. So once you land on this screen, and it tends to always land you on this particular employment page, but you see there's a link there for disciplinary actions. And so you'll click on that link and that will load the disciplinary action page, which will look like this. You probably don't have a bunch of other records already there. I guess it's possible, but normally, you know, unless you have a really active pilot, you're not going to have a bunch of records in here. So you can see in this particular sample, there's no records previously reported. So if you scroll down on this page, and it'll make sense when you look at it on the website. When you scroll down, you'll see the form for reporting your disciplinary action. And it just has these 4 questions. You have the date. Of course, that's the date that the action became final. And then you have what type, and your choices are termination, suspension, or written warning. Those are your 3 choices. And then you have the question, did this involve removal from operations? Because maybe it did or didn't, right? So you pick whichever applies there. And then it will ask you, are there relevant documents? And we kind of discussed those. They're also called supporting documents. And you just indicate yes or no. And then you click save, and that's it. And it will add that record to the pilot's PRD file. And once you've added it, you can come back and you can edit it. You can change it if you need to, if you got the date wrong or, something, whatever. But you can't delete it. If we talked about if they get overturned in the future, then you can come back and you can suppress these records, but which will make it, you'll still always see it when you look at it, but the pilot won't see it and other employers won't see it. But really, it's just that straightforward. It's just those 4 boxes there. So let me show you the next one, which is the separation record. So again, this is the, once you pick your pilot, this is the page that you'll land on. This is the starting page. It always starts from after you pick your pilot. And it's already on the employment page, which is great because that's the one that we need for this activity. Now you can see in this sample, there is already one employment record for this pilot. And if you look through that information there displayed, you see that there's a hire date of September 9th, 2021. So the pilot was hired in 2021, but then there's separation date and separation type, and those are empty. So this is what I was saying, where you can have an employment record for a pilot, and the single record is really the start and the end. So you can see here, they started in 2021 and they've worked for you up to this point, but now it's time to indicate that they've left your employment. So you can edit this record by clicking the box that I've got the arrow on, and then you can click edit, and that'll let you, it just brings up the form, and then you just finish filling out what you need. If it's a new record because you haven't entered one yet, then you could just hit add record, and that'll just give you like an empty form to fill out. So this is what the form looks like. And so you can see in this case, we had our PRD date of hire for September 9, 2021. And that's something that we reported, in the past. But now we're going to add that the pilot has resigned in this example. So we just indicate our separation date, and we indicate the reason that they left. We indicate again if there are any supporting documents or relevant documents, yes or no, and then we say update. And that's it. That'll save those changes. And if you need to edit that, you can in the future. Again, there's no delete, but there is a suppress if for some reason you need to hide the record. And while I'm here, I will mention another common question is, what if the pilot, works for you for a while and then they leave for a while and then they come back? What do you do? Do you just keep editing this single record? Our general advice is that you would have an employment record for that pilot for every, contiguous employment period. So if they worked for you for a couple of years and then they were off for a year, then you would have an employment record that indicates that. And then when they come back to you a year later, you could just make a new employment record and you'd have the new starting date. So it'll let you make multiple employment records like that. So, okay. So the last one is the NDR. This one is so simple. It's going to blow your mind. Okay. So this is again, the same landing page after you pick your pilot, and there's an option for NDR. So you'll click on that, and that will open the NDR reporting page. And the only thing that you do is you add the date of when you did the NDR review. I don't love the way it's phrased. It says NDR request date. That's not really phrased very well, and we need to update that. That's really, like I described previously, this date is really the date that you reviewed all the information that you got back from the NDR. Okay, so, and it actually says that in that little gray box above. Just enter the date that you complied with the request requirements. So, and that's it. Then you hit save, and that saves the record. So that one's really short and sweet. So that wraps up this webinar. We will get to your questions in just a second. I do want to point out that we have additional webinars scheduled. We have the next one is tentatively scheduled for February 23rd. And that one's going to be about the API. So, if you have interest in, and, if you have electronic records and you have an interest in your system transmitting pilot records to PRD instead of using the web forms, which I just showed you, then you might find that to be an interesting webinar. So, as usual, the schedules and the links for joining these webinars is at prd.faa.gov. So that takes us to the questions. I'm going to ask Stacy if she has any that would be good for us to discuss as a group.
Thanks, Chris. We do have a lot of great questions today. And one question that I see come through frequently in the PRD support is, what is the, if we can explain the difference between the complete date and the final record state in PRD?
Yeah, we can discuss that one. And I might even go back to show the slide that shows that one. Let me see if I can back up here. That's, it's a little out of scope for this presentation, but it's a great question nonetheless. And it is covered in the other webinar about reporting records, but it's such a great question. I do want to answer it. So they're talking about these two date options, complete date and final records date. So what complete date means is if you're a contributor and you're reporting pilot records, it may take you several weeks or several months. So I don't know how long it's going to take you to report this individual pilot's records, but I doubt you'll do it all at one time. You might, I don't know, right? But so you might report some records on Monday, and then you come back on Thursday and report some more records for this pilot. But at some point, you're going to get caught up, right? At some point, you're going to report all of the records that you have available for that pilot. And so that's what the complete date is about. So when you get everything caught up, then you can enter the complete date. And the person that sees that date is the next employer. That's really what's helpful to them, because the next employer, when they're looking at this record that you've created, they can see, if there is no complete date, the employer can say, they've reported some records, but there's some stuff not yet in the system. Right. It tells them kind of if they need to ask you for records or what, and then the final records date, that one is kind of the same thing. It means PRD is up to date, but it has a really important distinction in that it means PRD is up to date and there are no further records expected. So, this is a case where the pilot doesn't work for you anymore, right? So if the pilot no longer works for you and you fill all the records in, then you would enter a final records date. That way, the next employer, when they're looking at the records, if they see a final records date, that tells them that you've reported everything to PRD and there's nothing else to do. That's it. And then they won't bug you in the future, right? That's really the point to it, because if you don't have a final records date, then that tells the next employer that even though you had PRD caught up, 6 months ago, well, now there's probably more records and you haven't reported them for whatever the reason, right? Maybe you're a pack operator and you've delayed it, whatever. So that's what the complete date and final records date is about. It is discussed in the AC. So you can look over there. So what else you got, Stacy?
Okay. Let's see, another question that we get that I see come through, it was also up in here is, sorry, the screen keeps moving with the questions coming in, but this is back over to NDR. And does the NDR date need to be updated for all pilots or only new hires?
Yeah, good question. The NDR only applies to new hires. So, in other words, you don't have to go back and retroactively. Well, that's a good. I see what you're asking. Yeah, that's a good question. So, if you're a 121 operator or a 135 operator or a 125, then you presumably completed an NDR check when you hired the pilot, if it's been since 1997, when PREA required that check. Okay, because this requirement originated in the PREA, right, with the statute. So presumably you've done those. So really what you're asking is this a reportable historical record? And although I might reserve the right to do more research and make sure I'm giving you the best answer, off the top of my head, I feel like, yes, it is a reportable record. So, and how far back you go depends on Part 111. For some people, it's you just go back to 2022. For some people, you go back to 2010. And for some people, you go back to 2005. But if you did an NDR check, where presumably you would have, you'll report that record to PRD. I might double check that, and if I find an exception to that, I'll shoot it out to you guys in email and correct myself. But I think that's a good answer. I'm going to stick with it. Okay.
Okay, Chris, I have another question here from Andrew Maroney. And it asked if we could define professional disqualification, and then maybe even if we can provide an example as it relates to the pilot record database.
Yeah, that's a tougher one, because each operator is going to define these differently. And the agency hasn't really tried to define it because we don't want to make a rigid definition of something that's not compatible with the way the operator does it in real life, so we have some examples in the preamble language that says, for example, it might be like this. But like you mentioned professional disqualification, there could be people that lose their passport, for example. Okay. And perhaps a passport is required for the pilot to work for you. And so perhaps that falls into the professional disqualification example. I think I'm going to refer you to the Part 111 preamble, because they do talk a fair amount about this subject in the preamble. And if you don't know how to find the preamble, just email us at PRD support, and we'll shoot you a link back, a web link, so that you can find the preamble. And if you're like, what's a preamble? The preamble is where the agency talks about the reason behind regulations. So you can find that whole discussion, about why and preambles are I don't want to get distracted, but they're super useful for that purpose. Because, sometimes you read a regulation and you're like, well, I don't really understand what the point is. What is that about? Whereas if you go look at the preamble discussion, you can understand what the thought process was.
Very quickly, there's a lot of questions, but we do need to clarify there was a typo in the last slide. In the next webinar is scheduled for February 22nd, not February 23rd.
Oh, thank you. Sorry.
There. So
yeah, I'll always
just to clarify that.
Yeah, always check the schedule, prd.fa.gov. there's a table there of webinars. That's really the core. Thanks, Stacy.
And let's see. We also do have quite a few questions about record retention. Jonathan O'Connor asked this question and we get this frequently as well, is can I discard pilot records after they are entered into the PRD? I understand that the minimum that he must maintain new records is for at least 5 years per 44-703.
Yeah, that's a very popular question. And it makes sense that we get asked this frequently because people say, well, I've reported it to PRD, so why am I holding on to it? So, Part 111, which is really what we're talking about, Part 111 has a few record retention requirements. For example, we talked about the NDR records for 5 years. We talked about supporting irrelevant documents for 5 years. We talked about if you're a PAC operator, you can use the PAC exception, and then you got to keep records for 5 years. But even if you don't see a record retention in Part 111, like Part 111 doesn't say, it's silent really when it talks about reporting records. It doesn't say after you report a record, you must continue to keep it for 5 years. It doesn't really say that. And that's because there are a lot of other record keeping requirements. There's a handful of them, and they're not in Part 111, but for example, if you're a Part 121 operator, Part 121 specifies its own record keeping requirements. How long you have to keep, for example, training records. It's outlined there. Part 135 is the same. Some operators involved with PRD, they don't have any record keeping requirements like corporate operators. At least not by the FAA, not when it comes to, for example, check rides. But there might be other record keeping requirements, could be the IRS, or it could be something else. So our de facto answer on this sort of question is that Part 111 does not require that you keep those records after reporting them to PRD, unless it specifically notes that, in Part 111. But I don't at all want to imply that then you can get rid of them, because there are very likely other record keeping requirements that you have to meet. And I can't really tell you, because I'm not an expert in all those other subjects. But I hope that at least points you the right direction. We have time maybe for one or two more, Stacy, if you see a couple that are good for public consumption. And if there's not any good, easy ones, Stacy, for public consumption, then, if the rest of them are kind of tricky or take more research, then we can answer those, by email.
Yes. Yeah, I think that wraps up the questions that would most apply to everyone on here. But there's a few other questions that we can get back to on here.
Okay.
Individually.
Yeah, that makes sense. Like I said, if you're waiting for your answer and you're not hearing it yet, then, it just may not be best for this forum, but we will answer it by email a few days after the webinar. So I think with that being said, we're just about the top of the hour. I hope that you guys found this useful. And if you have additional questions, just send them into prd support@faa.gov. And we'll be happy to hear from you. So thanks. Enjoy the rest of your day. And that ends the webinar for today. Thank you.